And getting back to our regular scheduled learning in terms of the topics that we're going to be doing. And of course, a reminder that our learning should be a zuchut for our chayalim. And it should also be a zuchut for our chatufim that they should come home soon, bari, benefesh ubeguf. It should be also a zechut for all of those who have been affected by the war, those who are injured. And of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give our leaders the guidance to make the right decisions, Be'ezrat Hashem. So what I wanted to do this week and next week as well is discuss the idea of davening in a Beit Knesset. We did spend a lot of time. We've been doing introductory topics in general. We broke to talk about different Inyanei Diyoma, things that were happening in the Jewish calendar. And we even started with Moda'ani, which we'll get back to, the order of Tefillah, Be'ezrat Hashem. And we have done in the past talking about davening with a minyan and the importance of davening b'tzibur. I wanted to focus today on davening in a shul. Because as we're going to see, there is certainly a connection between davening in a shul and davening b'tzibur and davening with a minyan. They are two separate ideas, and therefore they warrant their own conversation. There are, as we're going to see also, there are Gemaras that talk about the value of davening in the shul, and sometimes it's not 100% clear whether the value is the shul itself or the minyan. So sometimes it could be a little bit unclear, but there are definitely many Gemaras that talk specifically about the power of a shul, the importance of davening in a shul, and that's what I wanted to focus today. So we're going to start by just really seeing a number of important Gemaras, foundational Gemaras that discuss the value of Beit HaKnesset, the value of a shul, and the value of davening in a shul. Start with source number one. Source number one is a Gemara in Masechet Megillah. The pasuk says, "Va'ehi lahem mikdash me'at." This is a pasuk that is referring to the times of Galus, that when God is going to send us out in Galus, says the pasuk, I will establish for them a mikdash me'at, a small mikdash, a small sanctuary, which seems to be referring to a smaller version of the Beit HaMikdash, a smaller version of the Mishkan. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, says Rabbi Yitzchak, what is that referring to? What is this mikdash me'at? Elu batei knesiot uvatei midrashot shebabavel. It's referring to the shuls and the study halls in Bavel. Now we're not gonna really talk about the relation between the Beit Knesset and the Beit Midrash. They tend to be two different places, although obviously there's also a value in having them both be the same. We're going to focus more on the shul today. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, so the mikdash me'at is the shul and the Beis Medrash. So we already see this idea that the shul and the Beis Medrash are meant to replicate in some way the status of the Beit HaMikdash. And
where's the first quotation from?
Forgive me, I don't remember 100%. I could look it up. I don't remember exactly where it is. I was looking at the Gemara this morning, but I saw where it was, and I forgot. But I can try to let you know. We can look it up afterwards. Okay. And although it specifically says Bavel here, I think the implication is that whenever referring to Gullus, and also obviously even while we're in Eretz Yisrael now, there is a certain status to the shul. And by the way, this also might have halachic ramifications. We're not going to discuss this now, but there's certain halachot that are connected to what you can do in a shul, what you can do with a location that's designated as a shul, because it has a certain status of holiness, a certain status of kiddusha, because it is replicated after the Beit HaMikdash. Where is it?
Yecheskel Lamed Aleph.
Yecheskel Lamed Aleph. Thank you. Okay. Rabbi Elazar Amar, Ze Beit Rabbeinu Shebabavel. Rabbi Elazar says, no, it's not referring to the shul. It's referring to, I think it's the house of Rav, I think is what he's referencing there. It's referring to a specific house in Bavel, which is another opinion, this isn't referring to shuls and Batei Midrash. It's referring to a specific place in Bavel that acted as a mikdash me'at. Darash Rava, says Rava, Mai dichtiv, what does it mean when it says, Hashem ma'on ata hayita lanu? Hashem, you were an abode for us. A ma'on means like a place, an abode, a place of living. Elu batei knesiot ubatei midrashot. So again, there's this sense that the Beit Medrash and the Beit Knesset is almost acts as the abode of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the place where HaKadosh Baruch Hu resides, kiviyachol, similar to, modeled after the Beit HaMikdash. Tanya. And then later on in the Gemara, Tani Rabbi Elazar HaKapar Omer, Atidin batei knesiot ubatei midrashot shebebavel. The shuls and the batei midrash in Bavel are going to eventually sheyikbeu be'eretz Yisrael. They're going to be transplanted into Eretz Yisrael. And again, here I'm understanding, and I think it's also appropriate, that Bavel here just means all of Gullus. Anywhere where there is a Beit Midrash and a Beit Knesset, they're going to be replanted back here. They're going to be reestablished here in Eretz Yisrael. I don't know. Again, we don't know if this means physically that God is going to uproot that really big shul in, Englewood, New Jersey, which is where I'm from, or any shul wherever you've been to, but certainly in Englewood, New Jersey, they have a big shul. Any shul in America, and they're going to bring them here and plant them right next to Nitzanim. I don't know if that's what's going to be, or if there's some symbolism here in terms of the impact of those shuls are going to somehow be replicated here in Eretz Yisrael. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Zachi kitavor beharim v'cha Carmel bayam yavo. They will come like Tavor in the mountains and Mount Carmel in the Yam. V'halo dvarim kal v'chomer. This is a kal v'chomer. Ma Tavor v'Carmel. The Har Tavor and Har Carmel are mountains. Shelo ba'u. According to the Medrash that it's referencing was that Mount Har Tavor and Har Carmel were supplanted and brought and were present at Har Sinai. Again, this is all imagery that we don't fully understand exactly what the imagery is meant to show us. But just like they were planted temporarily in order to learn Torah, nikba'im be'eretz Yisrael. Now they find themselves in Eretz Yisrael. Batei knesiot ubatei midrashot shekorin umarbitzim bahem Torah. In the shul and in the base medrash, where they are bringing so much learning and so much Torah learning and so much Torah study and also tefillah as well, al achat kama v'kama. Okay, so certainly any place which has this kiddusha is going to eventually be supplanted from where it is and brought to Eretz Yisrael. So what we see in this Gemara is, again, the imagery is actually fascinating, and we're going to see hopefully some of it today and some of it next week. The imagery is meaningful. There's specific meaning to each of the imagery that the Gemara is giving here. But we see that the Gemara is refers to the shul as a mikdash me'at, or the Tanakh refers to it as a mikdash me'at, and that they're also called the ma'on. It's the ma'on of Hashem, the abode of Hashem. And then the Gemara also tells us that these shuls, because of what they accomplish, are going to be eventually brought into Eretz Yisrael. They almost have like a din, as it were, of Eretz Yisrael. There's a certain spirit of Eretz Yisrael that exists in these shuls and in these batei midrash, even in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, continue next to the next Gemara. Tanya. Abba Binyamin Omer. Abba Binyamin says, Ein tefillah shel adam nishma'at ela beveit HaKnesset. A tefillah of a person is only going to be heard, or another way of saying that is ideally going to be heard in the most complete way in shul. Shene'emar, because the pasuk says, Lishmoa el harina ve'el hatfilah, to listen to the song and to the tefillah. By putting the two of them together, bimkom rina sham tehei tefillah. In the place where there is rina, where there is song, where there is a certain amount of delight and happiness, that is where you should be davening. Okay, and the Gemara is identifying the shul as a place of rina, which we're going to see what that means. But there's this association with a shul, with rina and tefillah. Sorry.
When Shlomo went to Mikdash, I think this is the
From Melachim. Okay. That he says at the time, right? Is rina and tefillah. That there should exactly. So again, we do exactly. We use it in the slicha. L'shma la'rina ve'latefillah. So there's this clear association. It's a beautiful with rina and tefillah. And the Gemara here is showing us that because the Beit Knesset is a place of rina, that is where ideally your tefillah should be as well. And we're going to see exactly what this means. Amar Ravin barav Ada Amar Rabbi Yitzchak minayin shehakadosh baruch hu matzui beveit HaKnesset. How do we know that God is found in the Beit HaKnesset? Shene'emar Elokim nitzav ba'adat el. That God stands amongst the Eidah, amongst the group of Hashem. Now, this last one, we could have understood that to mean that it's referring to a minyan, not necessarily to a specific place. But if you look at source number 3, the Eitz Yosef, which is a perush on some of the Agadita of the Gemara, says specifically, what does it mean ba'adat el? What does it mean amongst the congregation of God? Beveit moed shelo. He says this is referring to the place where God meets people, the place modeled after the Oel Moed, the place where God sets himself up. Shehu b'veit Knesset. So this is a reference, at least according to some, not to a minyan, but to the specific shul, that God is found in his home, in his meeting place. And now he explains, what does it mean that God stands? This is actually very, very interesting. Why does it say that God stands? Why doesn't God sit? Obviously, God kiviyachol is not physical, but why do they use the imagery of standing? Shekiviyachol hu omed sham im hamitpal. He stands there next to the mitpalim. Why is he standing? Says the Eitz Yosef, de aser leishev toch daled amot shel hamitpalel. Because within 4 amot of when a person is saying Shemona Esrei, you're not allowed to sit. And because God is coming and finding himself amongst us who are davening, therefore God stands. It's an interesting explanation. But the point is that according to this understanding, this is a reference to the shul, that there's a special status to the shul, that God is found within the shul. Okay. We have 2 more Gemaras to do before we start to really dig into this and understand it better. The Gemara in source number 4, Amar Ravin bar Rav Ada, Amar Rav Yitzchak. Ravin, the son of Rav Ada, it says in the name of Rav Yitzchak, Kol haragil lavo lebeit Knesset v'lo ba yom echad. Anyone who normally goes to shul and one day doesn't come, Hakadosh Baruch Hu mashil bo. Hashem asks after you. It's almost as if, if you have a group of people, or I'm just thinking as lahavdil, but I was just thinking about a show where you want to go to the place where everyone knows your name, right? And when anyone gets that reference, then hamevin yavin, okay, right? You want to go to a place where if you don't come one day, they're going to ask about you. They're going to. So it's almost as if a person often comes to shul at Hashem, and one day you don't come. Hashem asks about you. It's almost as if, again, the imagery is Hashem is here. Hashem finds himself within the Beit HaKnesset, and if one day you don't come, you're missing. You're missing to the group. You're missing to, quote unquote, again, Kiviyachol Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Skipping down now to the next part of the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Bisha'a shakadosh baruch hu ba beveit Knesset, when Hashem comes to shul, v'lo matza ba asara, he doesn't find a minyan. He comes to shul and there's not a minyan here. Miyad hu ko'es, he gets upset. Shene'emar madua bati ve'ein ish karati ve'ein oneh. It says in Yeshayahu, why did I come and there's no one here? I called and no one is answering. So here, what the Gemara is highlighting, and this is important, we're going to see this soon in a little bit more detail, is that the shul is specifically not just meant to be a place where we come, but it's meant to be a place of a minyan. Okay, that fundamentally, and this is going to be when we talk about what's the value of a shul, the first and simple and most practical answer is, why is a shul important? Because we've already learned about the value of davening with a minyan, and what's the best place that you're going to be able to come to daven with a minyan? In shul. We're going to see there's other values to a shul besides that. But at its core, the simple value of a shul is where you can come and daven with a minyan and therefore elevate your tefillot. Because as we've already spent a lot of time talking about, there is a tremendous value in davening, in having your tefillot together with a minyan. And that's why it's called, by the way, a Beit HaKnesset. A Beit HaKnesset means a house of gathering. Because this is the place where people congregate to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, from a practical perspective, if Hashem comes to the shul and he walks into the shul and he only sees, 5 men, that's what the Gemara is saying. He gets upset because he's saying this is meant to be a place of a minyan, and where is that minyan, quote unquote? Okay, so that's the next Gemara. Now we're going to look at source number 5. Source number 5 is another Gemara. This is a Gemara that we actually have done already when we did the sugya of davening with a minyan, but we're going to see that it actually now connects to davening in the shul as well. Amar le Rabbi Yitzchak Rav Nachman. Rav Yitzchak says to Rav Nachman. This was a story. Rav Yitzchak said, Rav Nachman, my time alo asi mar lebe kinishta litzluye. Says Rav Yitzchak says to Rav Nachman, why didn't you come to shul? We missed you in shul the other day. Where were you? Amar le lo yachilna. He said, I couldn't come. Amar le lechanfe mar la sara velitzle. So then why don't you gather 10 men and daven, somewhere else? If you couldn't get, obviously you should try to come to shul. If you couldn't come to shul, at least get a minyan. Amar le shricha li milsa. It was too hard for me. At the very least, what you should have done was found out when the minyan is davening, and at least time your davening to when the minyan is davening. That's why we saw when we did the topic of davening with the minyan that there's a value to, if you have to daven at home, at least try to time it so that it's when your local shul is davening, because there's a certain koach, a certain power to that. So he answered him, Amar le, my kulei hai. Do I really have to go that far and time it to the minyan, to the time of the minyan? Amar le, yes. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, my dichtiv. What does it mean when it says Va'ani tefilati lecha Hashem eit ratzon? And me, my tefillah to you, Hashem, is a time of ratzon. Eimatai eit ratzon. When is it an eit ratzon? Bisha'a shehatzibor mitpalalim. At the time when the tzibor is davening. Okay, so therefore, we see that the time when the tzibor is davening, that's a time of eit ratzon, that's a time of special power. And best, if you can't daven, if you have to daven at home for whatever reason, to daven at the same time that everyone else is davening. Okay, so at first glance, this Gemara doesn't seem to have much to do with our topic. This Gemara is talking about davening with a tzibor. But we're going to see that some Rishonim, some of the commentaries have a different girsa, have a different text on this Gemara, and actually insert Beit Knesset into this Gemara as well, which we'll see soon. Continues the Gemara. Yes.
For the first part was the Rav. So the Rav gave a shiur, then for even when you are outside, there should be as close to the shul as possible.
That's interesting. That you're saying, what she's saying is that she heard that in the time of the Quran, the rabbi gave a shiur about that if you're having the outdoor minyanim, you should have them as close to the shul as possible. Yeah, I mean with appropriate distance, but you're saying as opposed to just doing it in a random place, to try to locate it near the shul. So that's, I don't know. I mean, as we're going to see soon, part of the idea of davening the shul is the metaphysical reality and the metaphysical holiness of that shul. So it could be it's connected to that. It could also just be that the rabbi wanted to get people continued used to walking to near the shul, meaning it could just simply be a practical piece, which is you don't want people getting used to having a minyan right outside their door. Because and this happened in Corona. People got used to having a minyan right outside their door or in their house, and then they had trouble coming. So it could just be practically the rabbi wanted people to still get used to coming. If you can't daven in the shul, at least daven in the shul parking lot. So you're still associating, I don't know. I don't know. That's my only suggestion, meaning I don't know if there's a thing. I've never heard that before. I've never heard the idea that if you can't daven in the shul, at least daven in the parking lot of the shul. But it could be that those are some explanations for it, and I'm not 100% sure. Okay. Continues the Gemara. The Gemara in source number 5. Amar Reish Lakish. Kol mi sheyesh lo beit hakneset be'iro ve'eno nichnas sham lehitpalel. Anyone who has a shul in his city and he doesn't enter there to daven, nikra shachen ra. He is called a bad neighbor. Okay, you're a bad neighbor. Shene Emar, Ko Amar Hashem, Al Kol Shchenei Haraim Hanigaim Benachala Asher Inchalti Et Ami Et Yisrael. Okay, so says Hashem on all of the Shchenei Haraim, all of the bad neighbors, Hanigaim Benachala, who are found in the place where I have put Am Yisrael. That there's some kind of association with not associating with the tzibor and being called a shachen ra. V'lo od, says the Gemara, el shegorem galut lo ulivanav. When you do that, you cause galus, you cause you and your children to become exiled. Why? Shene emar, it says, I guess later on in that same parak in Yirmiyahu, hineni nitshem me'al ha'adamam. I will expel them or kick them out from upon their land. Ve'et beit Yehuda atush mitocham, and the house of Yehuda I will take out from amongst them. So a certain association again with not going to shul or not being a part of the community that ends up leading to galut. Continues the Gemara story. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan. They said to Rabbi Yochanan, Ika sabe beBavel. There are some elderly people who are living in Bavel. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Tam Avi Amar. He said, wait a second, how could that be? The pasuk says, L'man yirbu yimechem v'imei v'nechem al ha'adama. It only talks about living a long life in Eretz Yisrael. Aval b'chutz la'aretz lo. It doesn't say anything about having a long life in Chutz La'aretz. How could there be elderly people living in Chutz La'aretz? Answers the Gemara, Kevan da amrile mikadme umechashche lebeit kinishta Amar hainu dahanu lehu. What merit did these people have to be living in Bavel and still living a long life? Well, they used to get up early to go to shul, and they would stay late in shul because they were those people who would come early to davening and stay late in the shul. That was their zchut. Keta'amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, as Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, Kadimu v'chashichu v'ailu lebeit kinishta. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi tells his children, you should get up early and stay late in shul, ki heichi detorchu chayai, so that you'll live a long life. So we also now have this idea that if a person gets up and goes to shul early and stays late, is one of the last ones to leave the minyan at night, that is associated with living a long life. Okay, so we have lots of different imagery here that the Gemara is giving us for the value of davening with the minyan. One more that I want to just bring for you, and then we're going to really try to analyze this a little bit more. Source number 6, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. Tzarech Adam lehitpalel. This is Gemara Yerushalmi. B'makom shehu miyuchad litfila. A person should daven in a place that is miyuchad, is specially designated for davening. Matam. What's the reason? B'kol hamakom asher askir et shemi, the pasuk says, any place where I will mention my name. Asher tazkir et shemi lo ein ktiv. It doesn't say where you will mention my name. If it had said wherever you mention my name, that would mean wherever you are. You can mention my name and it'll be great. But the pasuk says wherever I mention my name. Ela b'kol makom asher askir, which means that there are certain places that God has designated to be the place where his name is going to be mentioned, and that's where we should be davening. Okay, now you might have thought that this was referring to a specific makom kavua, but this Yerushalmi goes on to say that even within a shul, you should have your own makom, which we've discussed as well. So clearly this Yerushalmi is not just talking about makom kavua, but it's talking about davening within a structure that is designated for tefillah. Okay, so we've seen a number of different Gemaras. Each of these Gemaras are highlighting different aspects of why it's important to daven, the value of davening with a minyan. We're going to skip source number 7, but in source number 8, the Rif is one of the Rishonim on. Sorry, you're right. Davening in the shul. Forgive me. I made the mistake. We're specifically talking about davening in the shul. The Rif in source number 8 is one of the Rishonim, and the Rif, when he quotes, we mentioned the Gemara earlier, the Gemara we saw, source number 5, that tells the story of one friend who said to the other, why didn't you come to shul? And he said, I didn't come because I couldn't. And he said, well, you should have at least davened at the same time as everybody else, because the pasuk says, Vani tefilati lecha Hashem eit ratzon. And the Gemara ends up saying, when is it eit ratzon? When the shul davens. The Rif in source number 8 has a different girsa, has a different text in that Gemara. And look how he quotes the Gemara. We underlined it for you. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishur Rabbi Yossi ben Zimra, ein tefilato shel adam nishma'at ela beveit HaKnesset. A person's tefillah is only going to be heard in Beit HaKnesset. That we already saw. That was Gemara number 2. But says the Gemara, where does it come from? Because the pasuk says, shene'emar va'ani tefilati lecha Hashem eit ratzon. Ematai eit ratzon b'sha'a shehatzibor mitpalim. Because the pasuk says, when is an eit ratzon? Whenever the tzibor davens. Okay, so here we have someone who takes that Gemara, which seems to only be talking about davening with a tzibor, and connects it to davening in shul. So all the Mefarshim say, where did the Rif, and it's not just the Rif and the Rush, where did they get this girsa? And if you look at the text seems to be talking about the value of davening with a minyan. So why is it mentioning a shul? So the Gemara, so many of the Rishonim or the Mefarshim explain that obviously there is a clear connection between davening in a shul and davening with a minyan. What's the connection? Where are you most likely to find the minyan? In shul. And therefore, when the Gemara was talking about the value of davening with a minyan, it also adds on, but you should daven in the shul. Because by talking about davening with the shul, that's the place where you are most likely to daven with a minyan, which is now we're going to get into why. We're going to get into what is the value of davening in the shul? Why is davening in the shul such an important thing that we have so many Gemaras to talk about the value? So answer number 1 is going to be, as we mentioned, a very practical reason. We know that it's important to daven with a minyan. We know that there is a value to davening with a minyan. And where is the place where you're most likely to find that minyan? In the shul. Okay? Even if we're not talking about a shtiblach where you can go at all hours of the day and find the 10 men at all hours for Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, any shul is meant to be the place where everyone comes together, and that's value number 1. That's explanation number 1 for why it is important for us to daven, to come to shul. However, that can't be the only reason. Yes?
The Hagdara of a shul as opposed to shtiblach or whatever you were saying.
I don't know 100%, meaning I can't tell you the straight up halachic definition. As I understand it, any place, I'm thinking myself, how you would, I don't know 100%, because for example, my street has a minyan and mariv, and every Motzei Shabbos. Does that mean our street is a shul? No. I think a shul is I think it's a building that has been designated to be used for the purpose of davening. Now, again, there are halachic limitations to what you can do and can't do in a shul. There are halachic discussions about this, and very often nowadays we say that most shuls that are built on condition that they might be used for other things as well, because that gives us the ability to sometimes use a building. For example, there are many shuls where they'll daven, and then not here, I don't think they do this here, but let's say certainly in shuls that are smaller, and then the next thing you know, they're taking out kiddush tables and they're sitting down eating kiddush in the shul. Why is that appropriate to sit there and eat kiddush in the shul? The answer is that usually most shuls that are built nowadays, it's kind of either they do it explicitly or it's understood that they're being built on condition that they might be used for other things aside from that. But I think a shul is defined as a place that has been built / designated for davening. That's, again, a layman's definition.
I'm just thinking that the idea could be that there used to be these brachot in Bamot, that I'm supposed to do.
There were certain times when bamot were allowed, correct?
Yes, until the Mikdash was built.
Yes.
Once the Mikdash was built, so these Bamot, the other places of worship were done away.
We're not allowed anymore, correct?
That everyone should perfectly done in a shul. I don't know. This is just off the top of my head.
You're saying that the shul is similar to a bam. If I understand what you're saying correctly. Oh, that it becomes a place to gather as opposed to the bamot. If I understand what you're saying correctly, yeah. What you're suggesting, which I think is a very nice idea, is that the shul has become what we call the mikdash ma'at, right? Right. The first Gemara we saw references the idea that a shul is a mikdash ma'at. So what you're pointing out, and I like the idea. I hadn't thought of it this way. Which is that, what was the reason? What's the reason why once the Beit HaMikdash was built, they couldn't have bamot? What if somebody wanted to? But what is about? Just to give a quick background, what we're referring to is the idea. Well, I asked what's the value of a shul. So what she's suggesting. Sorry, remind me your name. Okay, fine. What she's suggesting is that in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, bamot were personal mizbachot, were personal altars that people would build in order to be able to bring korbanot and to serve Hashem. And there were certain points in Jewish history when that was allowed to be done. Once the Beit HaMikdash was built, so then that was meant to be the place where everyone had to come. You weren't allowed to build your specific bamot. Why? Because there's a power to having one place that's where everyone is serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the same thing is, what you're suggesting, is the same thing with the shul. If you're move to a city, rather than every Joe, Tom, Dick, and Harry, in their backyard, setting up a place, and this is where I'm going to daven, there's something valuable of having a unified or a central location where the whole community comes to daven. Now again, that gets into an interesting question, which is, what about building more than one shul? Can you have breakaway minyanim? Does that mean that there's no limit? Does that mean you should only have one shul in town, which has 5 minyanim, or could you have 10 minyanim? So it raises the question. The comparison, I think, is valuable, but then I want to even take it a step further. Why was that so important? Meaning, what is the value aside from the Beit HaMikdash, which we know obviously was the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What was so unique about the Beit Mikdash that we wanted everyone to come there? And that's what I want to highlight. Meaning, what is correct? So that's but I think there's even more to it. I think there's even more to that, and that's what I want to try to understand is what is so important about. Let's say it this way: the first suggestion we mentioned was that's the place where you can get a minyan. It's the place where you can daven together with everybody else. But we're going to see very soon, right now, that can't be the only reason. Because if you look at source number 10, Rabbeinu Yonah, another one of the Rishonim, in his commentary on the Rif, he says that davening in the shul is so important that even, let's say, you missed all zmanim, you can't get a minyan. There's no minyan around anywhere because you're davening at 11:30 and there's no Chabad in your community, or there's no youth minyan in your community, and you want to daven. Where should you go to daven? The Beit Knesset. Look at source number 11. Source number 10. Source number 10. Forgive me. Afilu, underlined part. Afilu kishe'ein hatzibor mitpalelin. Let's say you're in a place where you can't get a minyan. Yesh lo le'adam lehitpalel bebeit HaKnesset. You should still come to daven in shul. Mipnei shehu kavua u'miyuchad l'tzlilat hatzibor. Because this is a place which is established and designated for communal prayer. Now you have to understand, this is a very fascinating thing that he's saying here. Because he's saying, since this is established for communal prayer, Even when you're not going to daven communal prayer because you're going to daven by yourself, you should still come here. That there's something about this place itself has something that even when you, because of the fact that it's established. Now, by the way, he's not saying, I want to clarify, he's not saying it's better to come here and daven by yourself than to daven with a minyan elsewhere. The poskim say it's better to daven with a minyan. Wherever you're going to be, it's best to be in a shul with a minyan. If the only minyan you have is not in shul and it's outside or somewhere else, you should daven with a minyan. But if you're not going to daven with a minyan for whatever reason, you should come here. Because the fact that this is miyuad or miyuchad or kavua umiyuchad l'tfilat tzibur, that itself has a certain koach and has something special, and that's what I want to try to unpack. Yes.
What do you think about an open space which has no walls or roof, but it's recognized?
But it's designated. Okay, that's an interesting question. Let's say there's a. I mean, it's not. One of the buildings here, not right here, but a little not so many blocks away. They've had a minyan. They've had a minyan in the park. The park right outside the building has a minyan every single day. Maybe Mincha Ma'ariv too. I definitely know for Shachars. Okay, so I guess what you're asking is that a shul? Meaning there is also a whole conversation. There is also a halakha conversation about whether you should be davening in an open space or if it's better to daven in an enclosed space. I think on the one hand, we generally assume that an enclosed space is better for your kavanah. For some people, maybe the open spaces. For some people, that being out on the open makes it more conducive. Again, conducive is a personal thing. Some people get distracted by the opening. I can't imagine that sitting there and davening in front of a slide is necessarily going to be better than sitting in front of the bima. Although I agree that being outside, so there are different. I think there's different halachic questions about it. Whether or not, if you have an area that's just an outdoor lot that has a minyan 3 times a day, is that considered a shul? That's a good halachic question. I don't know. I'd be hard pressed to think that would be considered a shul. But again, where do you draw the line? What if it's a tent? What if there's a tent that's been set up so it's like open on all sides? That's probably more of a structure. That I think is more designated. In an open area, I'd have. Again, I'm not opposed to saying, but I'd have trouble, I think, considering that to be designated as a shul.
Live now across the street there, with the big, 20 buildings, and behind it is a park. Every day outside, people are davening mincha in Outer Beach.
Right. Okay. I've seen it. So again, for some people it might be a remnant of COVID. For some people it might be convenience, and we're not going to get into whether that's right or wrong. I think everyone would agree it's better to come to shul. Whether or not they shouldn't do what they're doing, I don't want to get into that. But the other question you're asking is that considered a shul? I'd be hard-pressed to call that a shul. Hard-pressed to call that a shul. Might it still have the koach of what we're going to talk about? Again, when you start getting into what's the value of a shul, part of the value of a shul is a metaphysical idea that there's tefillot, that we're davening there. So maybe there's, but there's something more to it. So let's get into this. So then, right, so this idea that even without a minyan you should come to shul, the Rambam paskins like this as well. Look at source number 11. Source number 11. The underlined section, Le'olam yashkim adam v'ya'ariv lebeit hakneset. A person should always come and get up early and stay late in a shul. She'ein tfilato nishma'at b'chol eit ela bebeit hakneset. A person's tefillah will not always be heard unless you're in shul. V'kol mi sheyesh lo beit hakneset be'iro. Anyone who has a shul in his city, ve'eno mitpalel bo im hatzibur, he doesn't daven there with a tzibur. So again, the Rambam combines the tzibur and the shul, that they're together. Nikra Shachen Ra. Says the Kesef Mishnah, the Perush on the Rambam. What does it mean that your tefillah is not listened to or heard in a shul? Even the underlying part in source 12. Kolomar afilu kishe'ein hatzibur mitpalalin. Even if there is no minyan there, still there's a power to davening in a shul. Yitpalel bebeit hakneset lefi shehu miyuchad l'tfilat tzibur, because it is specially designated for tfilat tzibur. So something about the shul is unique. Now, what is special about the shul? So one idea we mentioned was it's a place where you're gonna have a minyan. Let's take it one step further. I don't have a minyan, but I still come into shul. Why is it better for me to daven here than anywhere else? Sefer Torah, good, okay. What else? Practically. From a practical perspective, what chances are, and this is what some of the Mepharshim say, your ability to concentrate, your kavanah will probably be better if you're standing here than if I'm standing in my bedroom or in my living room or I'm standing at some random park. Okay? So even from just a practical perspective, look at source number. We're going to skip now to source number 15. It says the Meiri. The Meiri is also one of the Rishonim in his commentary on Barachot. He says, why should a person daven in shul? Kol she'adam yachol lehitpalel beveit knesset yaseh. Anytime a person can daven in shul, he should. Mipnei shesham kavanat halev mitzuya. Because that is where a person can have proper kavanah. That is where, and now, again, the way I would say it, and I think this is the best way to say this, is that we all have associations with locations, right? Just like many of us, I'm 42 years old. My parents no longer have their home, but for even when I was, when I was younger, when I was married with a few kids, I walk into my parents' house, I automatically became a kid again. I sat down on the couch. Okay, this time I didn't turn on the TV. But there's a certain association we all have with different places. Okay, you walk into a place where you went to yeshiva, or you walk into a place where you were for a year, or you go, visit certain. We have associations. What is our association with shul? Tefillah, Kiddusha, concentration. And therefore, very, very simply, a person should come to shul because that is the place where you will be able to have the best kavanah. Look at source number 16. Hagot Maimoniot is a commentary on the Rambam, and he says something very similar in the underlined section on source 16. Kevan shekvar kavu sham makom letfilatan. This is a place that has been established for tefillah. Umitoch kach kovim atzmam yoter letfilah. Because of that association, people are more easily able to get into the tefillah mode when they're in shul. Umechavnim, et libam la'avihem shebashamayim. And you also are more able to concentrate and guide your heart towards Hashem. V'kovim yoter makom letfilatam mitoch shmitpalalim b'makom hamiyuchad lahem lehitpalel. Because this is the special place where you daven. That is your association. Now you have to make sure to keep that your association, right? Make sure that you don't do other things in the shul, because then your association with shul becomes something different. But if we're doing it right, shul is where we associate davening and becoming close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore, that is where we should daven. Source number 17, the Einei Yitzchak, has a very, very interesting explanation for why he thinks that shuls are able to help us with kavanah. Now, it's actually funny because the one person who often raises this issue is not here this morning. You'll understand what I mean in a second. But says the Einei Yitzchak, why should you come to shul, and why is that better for your kavanah? Because when done right, a shul has a good pace. And that pace enables you to daven slowly and appropriately. Okay, look at source number 17. Okay, source number 17. We're in the second line, the middle of the line, right after the letters ad kan lishono ayin kaf lamed. Perush leperusho, says the Einei Yitzchak in his commentary. Shebevet Knesset haderech lehitpalel b'mitinut. What does mitinut mean? Slowly, deliberately, with patience. Gam b'psukei de zimra. Even psukei de zimra, a shul will daven slowly. Ve'ena mimaharim lachtof. They're not looking, what's lachtof? Lachtof literally means to grab, right? You're going to chapa mincha. You don't chapa mincha, he says in shul. He says, right, I want to get it over with, okay? You're not just looking to grab it. And through that, when you daven, it will increase your ahavat Hashem and your yirat Hashem. And it'll make it easier for people to daven. If you're davening at a slow pace, you're davening at a deliberate pace, then your kavanah will be better. And then through that, your tefillot will be heard and hopefully accepted. Aval hamit palalim beveitam. But if people daven in their homes, be'ezeh minyan, and like he's referencing like a breakaway minyan or a stop minyan. Darkam lizalzel ulimaher b'psukei de zimra. They end up being mizalzel, disgracing and rushing the psukei de zimra. V'rach b'kriyat shema v'tfilah hemitunim. Now only by kriyat shema and by shmona esrei do they go slowly. Okay, he's being malamed zchut. He's thinking very highly of us. The question is whether we're living up to this or not. Okay? If all you're doing is going fast for psukei de zimra and going slowly for the later, you're not going to have enough time to gather your kavanah and to properly concentrate. And then your tefillot won't be answered. So what it causes your tefillot to be answered according to the Einei Yitzchak? It's going slowly. It's giving yourself time to concentrate to be able to then daven appropriately. Now, I will leave it to you whether your local Orthodox synagogue davens in this way, but what it does tell us is this is what it should be. This is what a shul should be, a place, or I would even say, and this is usually true of more yeshivot. Very often the yeshivot, okay, if you daven in a yeshiva goes at a nicer pace, a slower pace, and they see the tefillah as an opportunity to be able to go. Now, many of our shuls, I would argue, don't do this. And therefore, that's a separate question. What do you do if a shul doesn't do this? But the point is, what he's trying, at least the message is clear. The message is the more that we're able to concentrate and daven at a normal pace, the more that we'll be able to then, our tefillah will most likely be heard and be answered. What happens if you live in a shul that davens quickly? So as I mentioned before, in my opinion, it's very easy to always criticize everybody else. If you daven in a minyan where they go very quickly, nothing's stopping you from coming 15 minutes earlier to davening. Come 15 minutes earlier to daven, put on your talis and tefillin, for those who put on the talis and tefillin, and start Pesukei Zimra earlier. Meaning, in the end of the day, and I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to anybody else, very often, whatever complaints we have, there's things we could do. Either you find another minyan, find a minyan that's going slower. This Baruch Hashem in Yerushalayim, there's no lack of minyanim. Find a minyan that goes slower. Or adjust appropriately in the way that you can, which puts the onus on us more than it does on everybody else. That's just something that I would recommend. Yes.
So if you have a choice between davening in a shul, but they're discussing the stock market, as opposed to davening outside.
Interesting question. So he's saying, what happens if your reality is the opposite of what's described here? Where in shul they're davening quickly and they're talking and they're not, and outside is where the minyan is a better minyan. It's a very good question. I even distinctly remember people referencing the fact that during COVID they found, although there was the challenge that you couldn't daven with the minyan, they actually found that they were able to daven at a better pace and slower. And I don't know how many of us were actually able to do that, or how many of us actually davened quicker because no one was watching us. It really can go in both directions, okay? But so it's a very good question. I don't know. I think it's a personal question. Meaning, I think what I would ask is whether or not there's another shul that you could go to that you could have both, or whether there's a way that you could again come earlier and be able to stay in the minyan that goes a little bit faster, but challenge yourself a little bit more and be able to do both. That's the first place I would go. If you're really dealing with a choice of it's one or the other, it's either in shul or a minyan that goes a little bit slower. My inclination would be to go to the minyan that goes a little bit slower, but I'm not. But I think you got to challenge yourself to try to find a way to make both work.
What do you think about skipping some of the prayers, like skipping a psalm, if you want to go slow?
Oh, skipping a psalm to go slower is an interesting question. I have heard the name of Rav Schechter from YU that he would suggest that if, let's say, a person either has to say it really, like especially Pesukei Zimra, that you could skip some if it means going slower. But again, I think the onus would be on us to try to get there earlier, not have to skip. Meaning, I think if you get there and you're in that situation, maybe you could. But in terms of ideal, we should be striving for the ideal. Okay, I happen to know there's actually I live in Tel Aviv. Right near me is the community of Modi'in. I know recently of the community in Modi'in that they, about a year ago, I don't remember what the name of the minyan is, but they established a minyan that is announced, it goes slower. For those people, and we're not talking about it takes 2 hours, they're not singing everything. They just have a pace. They have a pace, and people know that when you come to that shul, they're going to be able to have more time to daven. And there's a real value to that, because especially when we talk about davening as an avoda, davening is something you need to work on. Davening is something you need to, for us to, and I'm talking to myself, run in there, get your talis and tefillin on, and jump in there and whatever they're up to, and then expect to be inspired when we're not putting in the effort. We're not putting in. I think there's something there that we really need to think about. Okay, so that's yes.
There's a sign in the Rush people that says that it says in the Shulchan Aruch that you should
Right, so there's a sign that where it says that you shouldn't daven Pesukei Zimra except out of a certain pace and not davening too quickly. Yeah, again, there's no question that's what we should be striving for. What are some other values to coming to a shul aside from we just talked about the practical element of davening with kavana? So there's a beautiful medrash. The medrash in source number 18 compares the act of coming to shul to the act of a person going to the mikvah. Source number 18. I apologize, it seems that the numbers are all messed up here, and there's another 14 and 15 later on, but I think we're up to 18. It's a Medrash Tehillim. Tanya, Rabbi Yaakov ben Elazar ben Yaakov Omer. What does it mean, mikvah Yisrael Hashem? That the mikvah of Am Yisrael is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Medrash, Ma mikvah metaher et hatimeihim. Kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitaheres Yisrael. Just like what does a mikvah do? A mikvah purifies a person. So too, Hashem, God, purifies Am Yisrael. Mi ra'oi lelech etzel mi. Then says the Medrash, if you want to become purified, who has to go to who? Let's say you want God to purify you, and you want to go through a process of purification to get to a higher level. So who needs to go to who? Ha-mikvah etzel ha-tameh. Does the mikvah come to the tameh person? Or ha-tameh etzel ha-mikvah? Or does the tameh person have to go to the mikvah? Answers the Gemara, the Medrash very clearly. Ha-tameh tzarich leilech v'leired litbol. No, who has to put in the effort? Who has to show that I'm coming to you? The person who is impure has to go to the mikvah. The mikvah isn't going to come to him. Kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitaheret Yisrael. The same way HaKadosh Baruch Hu will purify us. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael, Ani amarti lecha kish'ata mitpalel hitpalel beveit Knesset shebe'irecha. Where should you ideally be davening? You should be davening in the shul in your city. And then he goes on to say, if you can't come to your shul, then daven somewhere else. But clearly, what's the ideal? The ideal is to then, now what's the value of coming to shul? We're showing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm putting in the effort. I'm not waking up and expecting everything to come to me. I'm not coming and saying, I want to be inspired, I want to be purified, I want to be, but God, come to me, come to my bedroom, I'll stand right here, I'll even sit up for you, God. Right? But rather, what do we say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I'm willing to get up, I'm willing to walk the 5 minutes, the 10 minutes, the 15 minutes. I recognize that when I put in that effort and come to Hashem, as it were, that's showing my desire to become purified in the same way that a person looks to be purified through the mikvah. So the imagery of shul being a purification process, a process which one enters in order to become purified, I think is very, very inspiring. That this is what we do. We come to Hashem. Why do we come to shul? When we come to shul, we're showing HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we care about Him and that this relationship is important to us. When you have a relationship that's important to you, you put in the effort. You don't expect that. You don't expect it to come to you. Okay, a couple of other just ideas because before we end, what are some other ideas for the value of davening in the shul? Some of these we've mentioned briefly already. As aside from the practical element, it gives you a minyan. Aside from showing Hashem that you're coming to Him, and aside from we talked about how it also helps increase your kavanah, there's clearly a metaphysical element to this. That in a spiritual sense, the shul is the place where Hashem is found more than any other place. Look at source number 14. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "La'olam yashkim adam leveit hakneset." A person should get up and be one of the first ones to come to shul. Kedei sheyiskeh v'yimneh im asara harishonim. In order to be one of the first 10 people to make the minyan. She'afilu meya ba'im acharav. Even if after that 100 people come, kibel alav schar kulam. The first 10 people are the ones who get all of the reward. That's the Gemara, schar kulam. What do you mean? You mean the guy who came number 11, number 12, he doesn't get any schar, he doesn't get any reward? No, what it means is they also get reward, but who gets a reward that is equal to everybody else? The first 10 people. Why? Because the first 10 people create the minyan in shul. Says Rabbeinu Yonah in his commentary on this section in the Rif. Why does he do that? So says Rabbeinu Yonah, source number 15, the underlined section, the second underlined section, Mipnei shehashchina shora beveit hakneset kisheyesh sham tzibor. When you have the double part of a shul and a minyan, and you create that minyan within the shul, the Shekhinah now dwells upon you. Dwells amongst you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is found here. This is Hashem's home. This is Hashem's abode, as we saw earlier. And therefore, where should you be davening? Even if you're davening without a minyan, we saw that you should be davening without a minyan, you should daven here. Because, from a metaphysical perspective, this is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is found. And this has other ramifications as well. By the way, just to see it briefly, because we're going to conclude now. Source number 19, the Iyun Yaakov notes that if a person needs to daven in a different language other than Hebrew, if he davens in the Beis Knesset, then it's more acceptable to do so. Why? Because Hashem is here. Hashem is found here. Hashem is closer here. And therefore, even certain things that you shouldn't do elsewhere, you can do in the shul. And finally, in source number 20, the Iyun Yaakov, and we're going to say it outside, we saw that Gemara. The Gemara earlier established that all of the shuls of Bavel, or all the shuls of Golis, are eventually going to be transplanted back to where? To Eretz Yisrael. So says Iyun Yaakov, what that means is that every shul in Galus has a din of Eretz Yisrael. It's as if it has the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Hashem is there. That's what it means when we say Hashem is there. And therefore, if you need to find a place that you should be davening, you should be coming to shul, because it has that din of Eretz Yisrael. And as we see, it is eventually going to make its way to Eretz Yisrael in a symbolic way. Okay, so what we saw today was we discussed the value of davening in a Beit Knesset. We saw the main primary sources of the Gemara on the value of davening in a shul. The imagery of that is very, very meaningful. And next week, hopefully, we'll even expand upon some of the imagery that was talked about in terms of the importance of davening with a minyan. And we discussed a number of different reasons for what the value is. Number one, it's because it gives you the opportunity to daven with a minyan. But we also saw that even if you don't have a minyan, you should still come to shul. Practically, it helps enhance your kavanah. Metaphysically, it creates an aura and an avirah. You're in a place where Hashem is closer than other places. And we also saw the idea of, it creates this idea of coming to Hashem as opposed to expecting Hashem to come to you. Okay, wishing everybody a wonderful, wonderful day.